our second and a half steering committee meeting. I'm very, very, very deeply appreciative of all of your time. And thank you for being here.
Great, thank you. Let's go to the next slide and we're gonna go over some quick Zoom stuff. Y'all have probably been on a bazillion Zoom calls by now, but we have the chat function if you need and want to chat us. We also have closed captioning for those people who need it. You click on that and then say enable live transcription and you should be able to see subtitles. And we're doing this as a webinar, so all of the steering committee members are panelists. So you'll be able to chat each other and other panelists, I believe, and then public is welcome also, and they will be able to submit comments and questions through Q&A. So go ahead, next slide. So if you don't have a good audio connection, you can go under the audio menu on the bottom left and phone in. We recommend that if you don't have a good audio connection, but otherwise, just the regular Zoom stuff. Go ahead, next slide. If anybody has any ADA compliance issues, please give us a call at 707-565-3535, or you can email Michelle Montgomery. That's MICHELE.MONTGOMERY at sonoma-county.org. And again, we have live transcription if you need it. Go ahead, next slide. So my name is Tracy Cattleman. I'm facilitating this meeting today on behalf of Forever Green Forestry and Digital Mapping Solutions and Permit Sonoma. We've got a team with us today of Caroleon Sappert from Permit Sonoma, Esther Mandino from Digital Mapping Solutions, and myself and Amanda Simpson from Forever Green Forestry. And what we'd appreciate you all doing is introduce yourselves in the chat by your name and your affiliation. And also if you're, please let us check your chat or your participants and make sure your name looks like everybody's name's on there well, on there good, not well. We're gonna use the chat kind of as our roll call, so please do introduce yourselves there. And if you need to leave early, if you could let us know in the chat, that would be great. And also if you have any comments, especially if you need to leave early, go ahead and send them there, or you can always send us an email or give Caroleon a call. So with that, let's do a quick review of the agenda. Next slide, Amanda. So we're going to do some brief introductions, go over the agenda. Lisa's going to share a few words with us. Then we're going to have a brief recap of what we did last time, which was in March, which was amazingly already a few months ago. And then Esther's going to take us through a summary of what we heard in our 5 public workshops that we did in April and May, and then move us into the risk assessment and where that is and what we're looking at in terms of the CWPP document and the outline. And through all those, there'll be time for you all to ask questions, and we have some questions for you based on what Esther sent out, or Caroleon sent out, pardon me, last week, I believe it was, a packet. So you'll see a lot of those same slides today from your packet that are going to be on the screen here. And those will be the questions that we'll be discussing. And then after each section of questions, we're also going to open it to any public input questions through the Q&A. And then we'll end the meeting with a bit of open public comment, and then wrap up and confirm our next meeting in September. So with that, I'd like to introduce Lisa McKaylee to give us a little bit of perspective about why she's here and why we're all here today. So thank
you so much. Well, I was invited today just to share a little bit about, I think, what we see as the opportunity here, and why I think the CWPP is so important. You know, Pepperwood's role has been very much being a living laboratory where we can test fire resilience methods. But with respect to the county as a whole, we've been really passionate about bringing the best available science to bear in generating a fuels model with some of the team members here, and now a fire hazard index that's been generated as part of the integrated hazard mitigation plan. And I just try to let everyone I know I meet in the community, like, how important the CWPP is. And I know sometimes there's frustration. It seems like there's a lot of science. You know, when does that science get turned into action? And I think part of how I explain the role of this plan is, like, this is going to be the action planning step. Like, this is where we really need to hear from everyone in the community how to put the incredible data of Sonoma County to work for our community's resilience. And also for, there's a lot out there right now about the need for climate resilience and climate action, and that the Community Wildfire Protection Plan to me is a climate adaptation plan for our community. So I just want to say I'm, volunteering to do this because I think it's so important, and I really appreciate being on this panel and steering committee with all of you with whom I've worked for a long time. And I know we're all very overcommitted and we have to get to a lot of different kinds of meetings, but I also feel like we can all be spokespeople to really make sure that we hear the voices of frontline communities. And myself, I participate in the Latinx Climate Leaders Group, for example. So I think all of us sort of being creative and helping support the county staff who can really, for me, this looks like a very small budget they have to work with. So just kind of being a cheerleader for all of us, being creative about what we can bring to the process and helping to leverage our networks to really encourage as much public participation as possible in the plan development and helping people get out of that overwhelmed feeling. I think that so many people feel that, what's the right thing to do and how are we going to decide, but this is really the chance. So I'm giving my rah-rah votes for that. And if people want to find out more about the data sources I talked about, I'm happy to be a resource. I feel like that's kind of the peak part I can help bring to this panel and the steering committee. So thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Amanda, why don't we bring the slides back up? And Carolyn, do you want to remind us all what we did however many months ago in March at our first meeting?
Great, happy to. So in March, we talked a little bit about the roles of the steering committee, of all you guys who are here today. And again, thank you for being here. Our expectations for all of you in this process are that we just really want your engagement in this process in order to provide guidance, leadership, oversight, provide those in really critical points of contact into the communities that we might not know on our own, but you can lead us to. Your input in this plan and moving forward is absolutely critical. So thank you so much for showing up. Your expertise, we really need that. We really need, because we don't know this whole area like you know your areas. So please make sure and chime in with any opinions you have, your feedback, everything at all stages of the CWPP process. So that's kind of your role. Tell us what you think, no matter what it is, respectfully, of course. So we got that done. We approved our ground rules, and we talked a lot about the CWPP process and what was going to be happening, which was that would be working along on the risk assessment, which Esther and the team has been doing in an awesome way, and we'll be talking about that. And we did all of those public input workshops. There were 5 of them that we did throughout the county. And again, we'll be talking about the results from those workshops this afternoon. A lot of interesting data there. I found the process to be really interesting and very cool to participate in. Our next steps are going to be that we're going to start reviewing all of the data that we got in on the larger scale and working towards creating the new CWPP, which is super excited. And I'm just really hoping that everybody stays plugged in and we're getting everything that we can into this plan because we need it desperately in this county. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So we're going to move on now to Esther's going to tell us about what we learned through those 5 public input workshops. So take it away, Esther.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to go through these slides fairly quickly because presumably you've already seen this, or at least I hope you have. And maybe if you haven't, and I don't want to call you out, but I was going to say if this is new, you're more than welcome to review that packet afterwards in the data. There's links to the data in that packet, so you could look at the raw data if you wanted as well, because we did do stuff. So I'll talk about it. So we had 5 public meetings that were in April and May, and we asked everyone who attended. Most of the meetings were well attended. We had most of them, I would say like 3 out of 5 of them, we had over 100 registered. And, you know, it was the norm to have about 40 to 60 people in the meetings. And so we had quite a few people showed up. And they were asked what values they considered were at risk from wildfire, what wildfire risk and hazards they knew about that were in their community. And we also asked about what projects they thought that we could do that would mitigate those risks and hazards to those values. Next slide, please. So let's the first question, the values and assets. So exactly what is that? So there are people, places, and things that we want to protect from catastrophic wildfire, right? And because this is FEMA, they're paying for the bill. We're using and because we're integrating this into the larger multi-hazard mitigation plan, we wanted to divide out those values into what FEMA calls community lifelines. And if you want, there's a description online that talks about them. They're basically, well, we'll show you the list, but it's just a list of the things that we'd want to protect, you know, whatever the hazard is. And so, but they're not exactly what we would call values and assets, right? So it was a little hard to try to categorize how we normally think of values and assets out there, categorize that under the community lifelines. And so what I did, there's this vague category called food, water, and shelter, and that's pretty much where everything got lumped into. And then I subcategorized that out. And that's what the last line there is that, so we divided it out into agriculture, community, which included entire communities, businesses and key community features, historic features, homes and people, infrastructure, livestock, pets, schools, vulnerable populations, wastewater infrastructure, watershed, which included a whole host of things like forest health, ecosystem health, native species, the park down the street, all that stuff, and wineries. Okay, next slide, please. So this is in those broad FEMA categories. You know, it pretty much came out to what we expected. Most folks wanted to protect the things that were most important to them, which was food, water, and shelter. And then next was transportation. And when you see that word transportation, it actually means evacuation routes, because that's primarily what people were talking about. And then communications was the third largest. And then there was a smattering of safety and security, health and medical, and energy. So that's the broad. There's a question. So were the food, water, shelter subcategories presented and analyzed as their own category on par with energy transportation? No, that's good. That's a good idea. Wineries or vineyards. They specifically were talking about wineries, but I don't know if I'd have to go back and do a search of the data to see if vineyards were mentioned. Okay. So this next slide that we're looking at, it's the detailed breakdown of the food, water, and shelter values and assets. And one thing I think is really important to know, and this may be because the way we ask the question, but one thing that I found was really interesting was that watershed, which included, you know, ecosystem function, wildlife habitat, all that, you know, stuff, was mentioned just as much as communities, entire communities. And so people really value the landscape around them. And so we need to reflect that, right? Next slide, please. So these are just the most common, so of the, it's just a different way of looking at that pie. Next slide, please. So key findings was that what I just said, watershed assets, things such as old growth forests, wildlife, open spaces received as many votes as the other community assets, such as churches, businesses, and homes. Egress and ingress or evacuation was the next most mentioned and voted on value. So Ellie asks, how is community different from homes and people and schools? Community was when people said like they didn't say homes or or their neighbors, they said Glen Ellen. So like the entire town of Glen Ellen. And so I felt that that was different enough. And so I made it its own category. But we could, but if, you know, if you guys think that that is something that doesn't make sense, maybe I should lump it all together again, just let me know. Okay, so the next thing that we asked was risk hazards. And what exactly are those? So risk and hazards are places, structures, materials, circumstances, and situations that could lead to a wildfire. And so the way people interpreted that and provided information to us was in the form of lack of something, right? So it's the lack of resources it means that they were, so it's the inability to abate risk due to either financial, physical, or social economic limitations. And there was also, people mentioned things like lack of policy, and that includes barriers to existing policy that creates, barriers within existing policy that create, to mitigating wildfire risk. Okay, so lack of policy also includes barriers exist. Somehow that sentence doesn't make sense when I try to read it, but basically that policies are creating barriers so that we can't mitigate that fire risk, right? And the basic example is the CEQA. Next slide, please. Okay, I was just, sorry for the pause. I'm reading the comments because I think they're useful, and maybe, you know, we don't have to be, this does not have to be a formal presentation. If you want to speak up, just go ahead and unmute yourself and interrupt me. That's fine. But Caitlin said that it would be helpful to see the subcategories of food, water, and shelter on the same pie chart as the other FEMA categories. And Amanda actually did mention that I should do that. And I said, no, that doesn't make sense. But it obviously does. So yeah, we could do that for sure.
Great, thanks.
And then, yes, and Tracy wanted to remind me that we asked people to think about community scale values versus their own homes. But, you know, with that said, people did put down their own homes many times. And so that was, you know, they were thinking of both things, I think. So
I wanted to remind folks, if you're using the chat, send it to panelists and attendees so people who aren't in as panelists can see the chat conversation as well.
Yeah, I have a question. So before this meeting, you asked the panelists at least to have read through everything. And I'm wondering, are we like speed running through this right now? And then we're going to go back and chat? And excuse me if you already explained that today and I just went right over my head. Or if you'd rather us stop at each one of these three main sections.
You can do whatever you go ahead. You can do whatever you prefer, but what we were going to do is review this, and then we have some questions and discussion about the whole section. But if you have a specific question, feel free to interrupt. And when anybody
hold off.
Go ahead and introduce yourself if you don't mind. Thank you, Jason.
Yeah, I'll hold off until later. Yeah, sorry.
We've got plenty of time, so I think we'll be good. I think we'll have time for discussion. Go ahead, Esther.
all right. So risk and hazards. These were, as you would expect, the biggest one was that folks identified was the lack of hazardous fuel treatment. So that included vegetation management, roadside maintenance, post-veg post-fire veg management, and prescribed fire and defense. Did we include defensible space in that? I think that was, I thought it was separate.
That's a really important point.
Yeah,
Whether that's in that lump or not.
that is, and I could look at the data real quick. I had it open, but I'll make a note to check on that because I thought I had separated that out, but I will if I haven't. Okay.
You have defensible space under lack of hazardous fuel treatments on the pie chart.
Yeah, on the pie chart, but I think in the actual data, I had separated it out. So we might have been trying to minimize how many different categories we were looking at, but I will make sure that it is separated out because it should be. Yes, it is. It is. So it's a function of the pie chart. So sorry about that. I will
Does that
fix that.
mean that defensible space was so small that we don't see it?
No, it was, I can share my screen instead if we want to look at the actual data. Or we could do that when we get to the discussion part.
Huh?
Okay,
And
so
was it determined why risks and hazards are put in the same pie chart? Was there, they're different. And I was just wondering if that bears any, if anyone else noticed that.
they are different, risk and hazards are different, but people think of them kind of like, it's fuzzy, right? So people
Yeah.
think of them kind of in the same, and so when we asked the question, we lumped it. So the answers are lumped.
Okay.
Yeah. But I understand what you're saying. Yeah, okay, so let's next slide. I can't remember what's on the next slide, but we'll go to it. So it's same data, just different different look. So you can see that defensible space is on there. So again, the lack of vegetation management was which is a little unfortunate. One of the things that we noticed was that lack of structure hardening was kind of in the middle there, under they're at number 16, right? Either under or above climate. I think the fact that it's on there is a testament to all of the work that folks like Carleone have done in the county to try to get folks to think more about their home versus the land that's out there. But folks really want to see vegetation management done in the county, that's for sure. And so I think we definitely have work in convincing folks to do more structural hardening, but also responding to the need to do vegetation management and adequate egress and ingress.
And I would say the structure hardening might be low because a number of people are rebuilding their homes, so they
That's
are
true.
thinking
That's
about
true.
that. So
Yeah,
just
that could be. Yeah, I hadn't thought
should I
about
be talking in chat versus just butting in?
that. Oh no, you can butt in.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, either way. And I was paying attention to the chat and then I stopped paying attention to the chats. So sorry. So if you have put something in the chat that you want me to respond to, interrupt me. All right, next slide.
And while you're doing that, Lisa, yeah, we did speak about home hardening. So Carleone did a presentation on home hardening, defensible space, all that, before we went into the breakout sessions for people to identify their issues. So we did a fair bit of intro for those of you who didn't make a meeting, kind of what to do to prepare for upcoming fire season.
Got it. I think I was late to that meeting, but she always does a good job, so.
Next slide, please, Amanda. Great. So the key findings again, 97 people voted for lack of vegetation management. 16 of these votes expressed concern over eucalyptus groves. 78 people expressed concern over lack of adequate ingress and egress. So things like narrow roads, dead ends, one way in, one way out, or limited emergency vehicle access. And one person expressed concern about the effect of overuse of vegetation management on fish and wildlife. So while folks identified the environment and ecosystem function and wildlife habitat as a value, they didn't express that in the risk and hazards like that they had, which was another interesting thing. So I don't think they see that vegetation management is going to affect all of that, which we all know it can if done incorrectly. So next slide, please. So the third question was, what projects do they want to see, basically? So, and we explained to them what projects were and that there are a set of actions that can be taken to reduce that wildfire risk. So planning projects include actions such as capacity building, analysis, prioritization of projects, and improving interagency cooperation. Community organizing projects included things like included actions that fund, support, and establish local and regional community groups. Next slide, please. The projects are a total mirror of the risk and hazards. So lots of hazardous fuel treatments were identified. Also a lot of education and planning, which was great. Communication and mapping, infrastructure and home hardening was up there, and evacuation as well. And the surprising amount of enforcement. I don't think they really want that, but that's what some folks emphasize. Next slide, please. And this is just another way to look at the data for those who like bar charts instead of pie charts. Next slide, please. And then the most common projects were hazardous fuels, what I just said. Next slide, please. Projects identified were, again, the key findings were that projects identified were relatively consistent with the risks and hazards identified. 101 votes were for projects to reduce hazardous fuels. 97 voted for lack of vegetation management. 67 votes for projects to improve evacuation, and 78 voted that lack of ingress egress is a risk and hazard. So very presumably the same people who identified that risk and hazard came up with a project to reduce it, or identified the need for projects. So next slide, please. Oh yeah. Oh, I forgot about this. Sorry, we put this in at the last minute and I completely forgot about this. Do we want to do the discussion first before we talk about this subcommittee?
I think we should. So why don't we, Amanda, go to the next slide and then we'll come back to this slide that we got those in reverse order.
Yeah, okay. So, and I see that there's lots of things in the chat, so maybe I'll go through the chat as you're thinking about these questions, and hopefully you had a chance to actually review the data and maybe even look at the Excel sheet. Because when you go to the Excel sheet, you'll see the actual stuff that people gave us. Some of them were fairly vague, and so we categorized them, right, to make it understandable and be able to do something with the data. So if there's something there that you think is missing or that was not identified, obviously we want your input. All right, so let's go through the chat.
And meanwhile, while you're looking at that, Esther, so we shared this with you last week to give you kind of an intro to it, and we can send you again, or if you look at that email, you can get the link for the Excel. We can find that and put it in the chat too. What we wanted to know is, are there values, risks and hazards and projects that aren't represented or captured in this information that you think are important that we include in the CWPP and the risk analysis and the risk assessment? So we want to hear that from you, and then also overall feedback, which there's been some great conversations in the chat. I think what we can do now, Amanda, is turn off the slides and open it up, remove the spotlight and open it up. If anybody wants to raise their hand and talk, please do, or you don't have to raise your hand, just speak up, because I think we're good on time.
Yeah, real quick, you guys. So looking at the data, and I put this in the chat, Roberta McIntyre, Fire Safe Sonoma. So looking at the data, I'm struck by the lack of the highlighting of structural hardening being an issue. So that tells me either, well, it tells me right away that Fire Safe Sonoma and others, I think, need to really start pushing the fact that structural hardening is more important even than defensible space, according to the studies done with the recent fires we've had. So that's something that really struck me and is something that needs to be worked on in terms of education and outreach.
I have a question actually about that data. So how many votes would an individual have? You know, did you have like a rank top 3 was it just a, what is the number one thing that you think is the most important? And how is that going to play into why people might not, even though you literally just told them about structural hardening, why that might not have been such a big deal? I mean, like, you know.
Good point.
Yeah.
So the process was that everybody could identify information, items and values, risks and hazards projects on the idea boards. And then we asked everybody who was in the room to give them an upvote. So that was the voting process, but anybody could vote for any of them that they liked. So it was definitely who was in the room.
So you could vote for a number of things, and
Yeah,
people
right.
just chose not to vote for certain values.
Correct.
and we asked people to not vote for something twice, and it didn't seem like anybody did because there weren't any real obvious items that had a whole lot of votes.
Okay, so now that you just say that, that makes me think that people were thinking they had one vote. What's the number one?
The one vote per idea, but they could vote on any
Oh.
number. Yeah. So they could vote on 10 different ideas, but
Understood now.
or 100. Yeah. However many ideas there were, they can vote on them.
That clears up a lot. Thank you.
Okay, and let's do Misty, then Ellie, then Caitlin.
Great. Thank you, Tracy. So my name is Misty Wood. I'm from the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office, and our role during fires is evacuations. And so that's my perspective coming to this conversation. So there were two assets that I didn't really see clearly identified. One are radio towers or radio infrastructure, and that's what deputies and dispatch rely on in the field when we're conducting evacuations. That level of communication amongst ourselves is really critical in safely completing those evacuations for the deputies and for the public.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing that wasn't really clear to me that was identified that should be are telecommunications facilities, cell towers.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the public relies on to receive emergency alerts. Oftentimes it's one way that the county or the city or the sheriff's office will provide emergency alerts to folks. So for both of those facilities, I would like to see those identified, mapped out somewhere, have a risk assessment conducted for each of those facilities, and if appropriate, have the project identified as part of that, depending on what the risk assessment shows. The other comment I have that's a little bit more granular, and I'm not sure if it's appropriate for this plan, but I wanted to bring it up, is locked gates. And that as we're doing evacuations, locked gates, when deputies don't have a gate code, it's much more difficult. We can get in, but it's much more difficult to get into a property to notify somebody of an evacuation in person if their gate is locked and we don't have the code. So the first two I feel very strongly about, the telecommunications facilities and radio facilities. That third comment about gate codes, I'm going to throw it out there and rely on you guys about if that's too specific or not or appropriate for this project. But thank you for giving me the opportunity to share that perspective.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Pushing Knox locks on all those gates is something
So
that a lot of the local community plans have done.
So just to be clear too, Carly-Ann, so fire has Knox box keys, but deputies don't. So the important thing for deputies in doing evacuations is having the gate code. So when we're doing public education with folks, we ask them to call dispatch before a fire, call dispatch, tell dispatch what your gate code is, and we put that securely into our system. So when a deputy goes up to somebody's house, they don't have a Knox box key. They can call dispatch and say, hey, I'm at this address. What's the gate code? And dispatch can say it's whatever it is. And that will allow the deputy easy access to that property. Does that make sense? The distinction between the two? Okay.
I didn't realize that.
This is Steve, the fire marshal from the county.
Go ahead.
So just to tie into Misty's comment about Knox box keys, we've provided over 100 keys to the sheriff's office, so they're distributed through personnel. So they do have access to some of the keys for the Knox box system. So I would suggest we could look into providing a better need to access for the keys to help out with those issues regarding gates.
Yeah, and this is Cindy Foreman with Sonoma County Fire District. Same thing. We've given keys to particular deputies at times as well. We just have to have accountability for those, and they have to have a way to secure that key. So yeah, Steve brought up a great point. We can work with our sheriff's department on making sure that we get those keys in their hand, because as we all know, everybody's not going to call Redcom and give them their gate code. So yeah, thanks, Steve.
Hey, and sorry, one last thing.
Go ahead, Paul.
The only thing I would maybe recommend is making it clarify or making the recommendation that agencies do the dual, so that it helps with what Cindy and Steve are talking about. So like the Knoxes in Santa Rosa are dual keyed, where there's one key that will open in both gates and buildings, and then there's a separate key that law enforcement has that just does gates.
Thank you. Go ahead, Ellie.
Yeah, hi. I'm with the Sonoma Ecology Center and also the Resilient Landscapes Coalition. And we fortunately just got a grant for over $100,000 to help do education. And the main thing that we're focusing on, and I wanted to bring up here, is the defensible space zone that's sustainable. And what I'm recognizing in a lot of the work we've done so far is that, and it's showing up in these in this data, that people really do think the fire is coming from out there. And the more they understand that it's not just home hardening, but it's the 0 to 5 and ladder fuels, that, you know, just having a deeper understanding. And Caroline, I just want you to know we're ready to go hand in hand with you to try to get that message across. And I don't know how to do it through the CWPP, but it really does need to be thought of as a specific project that people can tackle fairly easily, and don't, you know, they don't have to feel like they're victims of the wildfires coming at them.
Good point.
Thank you. And Caitlin?
Hi. So I had a hard time making sense of the public input data because of the way that things were lumped and split and then represented. Like it took me several going backs and forths between the different slides to see that, for example, watershed got as many votes as transportation as an asset, because those were never presented next to each other. So if you're going to represent that data again to any audience, I would suggest putting those subcategories, reporting them the same way that you gave them to the public to comment on. And I think that means that each subcategory is at the same level as the FEMA categories, I think. Anyway, I found that very confusing. So I couldn't, but the main point I want to say, you were asking for missing elements. And I think a really important missing risk is, or hazard, is flammable houses. People, kind of going on what Ellie said, people think the fire's coming to them from outside, but we have a lot of houses that have caught from other houses. And if we don't identify those as risks and hazards, then the CWPP won't be aiming projects and resources and attention at them.
Correct.
Well, and that's a great segue into Lisa's question, which actually will lead us into the risk assessment conversation in terms of, I don't know if you saw that, Esther, public comment versus expert input. So that might be a good way to transition into the risk assessment conversations. So do you want to address Lisa's question first and then jump into those slides? Can someone address how this plan will weigh public comment versus expert input? Is our goal to meld/balance? I thought it was a good point to use the results to inform educational needs. I also think it's good to augment public input priorities with these expert-based needs, which is exactly what we're doing in the risk assessment.
You know, and I might say about the structural hardening, just not to beat that, that, you know, people think of their houses, their homes as safe, and the big scary things is coming from way out there. And so sometimes it's not just an education piece, it's it's a social piece, it's an emotional piece, you know, that your house is not safe, or, you know, just saying that your house is not safe doesn't, you know, it just popped up to me. So I just thought I'd share that.
And I, in all my years of doing this I think is the biggest thing we're up against. is, I'll be out there doing a structure assessment with somebody and they're grabbing my arm and trying to get me to turn around and look at the park, because the park's the problem. It's 6 miles that way, but that's the problem. And they've got, I've used this joke a million times. They've got a bale of hay with a can of gas and a lighter leaning up under their wooden deck, and they're still trying to get me to blame the park. And even when you're directly talking to them, and I think that it's a very basic human instinct that we're up against. And it's what Lisa said. It's that my house is my haven, my house is my home. Don't
attack
to
it.
my
Yeah.
brain. Yeah. And so it's psychologically, I think it's a very difficult thing for people to understand. And getting the research to resonate with people is critical. Generally, I think people don't understand what the research is telling us and that the research is true. And I think that this is a difficult environment for science-based assessment, generally speaking, right now. And so there's just a lot of pushback, and it's a challenge. And we have to bring all of our resources to bear collectively to start really moving that message forward. Also, the ugly truth about projects is the low-hanging fruit are projects where you can hire a crew and send them out into the forest with chainsaws to cut up a bunch of stuff. The really hard stuff is the stuff where the home's involved. And I know that because I'm trying to do that, and it's hard to do. Anytime you're touching someone's home, it's really difficult. There's a million things that complicate that process. So this is not going to be easy, but it's going to have to start with a deep instinctual understanding that my house is the first thing that I need to deal with. My house, and Ellie, I include the 5 feet in the structure hardening. To me, that's part of structure hardening. So
Can I say something? This is Robert Aguero, Forester with Permit Sonoma. I think it's really important that we're talking about the importance of structural hardening, immediate defensible space, but the public did identify fuel management, fuel reduction as a priority. And I mean, the research also shows that a landscape, the county in this case, is only as resilient as its weakest link. And so I think it's important that we do take seriously the importance of landscape level fuel management while balancing the importance of structural hardening. So I just want to make sure that that's conveyed in the CWPP.
Okay. Yeah,
and I completely agree with that, Robert. It is critical, and it's critical for a lot of reasons. And one of them being those large scale fuel breaks are important. They're important for the environment, and they can work in a lot of conditions that are going to hit us. And also this is such a huge mountain to climb to get up to the top of the structure hardening mountain. If the low hanging fruit is getting out there with chainsaws and doing stuff, we need to do that too. So I couldn't agree more. But it does need to be balanced.
I think it's what Robert said highlights for me something really important. It was a note I took looking at the slides ahead of the meeting. He used the word resilient. Like, people use that word 45 different ways. So, and there's a place in the table of contents that you're proposing that says something about the wildfire problem. These very, very vague words and terms, I think, are critical to define, because if you mean like forest resilience, that's one set of things. But if we're talking about like the resilience of Sonoma County's people and economy to withstand a wildfire, that's like, you could go in very different directions depending on which definition of resilient you're using. And so to prevent the CWP trying to do all things for all people, for all purposes, I just want to urge us to define terms.
Thank you.
Good point.
We could talk for hours on this, but we want to get through some of these other slides to let you know what's going on with the risk assessment and the table of contents. But we still have another hour, so go for it, Esther.
All right, I'm going to blow through these too. So what's the purpose of the risk assessment? It's to help us prioritize projects and identify high hazard areas, high fire hazard areas based on specific criteria. can someone put the link in the chat to the hub site? So on the hub site, we have just a preliminary view of it. And you can either go there now or whenever, it doesn't matter. Next slide, please, Amanda. Great. So we were going to do a normal, or I don't know, want to call it a normal, but it was going to be a raster-based risk assessment. So it was like all the other risk assessments that you see out there. We were going to take a bunch of data, give it a value, give it a weight, and combine it all together, and boom, there's your number. And there's so many products that are being produced right now that are doing that we didn't want to produce yet another one that may conflict with what is already coming out or will be soon coming out. And Sonoma Water is also is doing a risk assessment. Its focus is a little different, and we were hoping that we can combine our effort with theirs, but the timing isn't going to work. And so I came up with a bright idea that we'll just do, well, it was a bright idea based on a bright idea that Mark had, Mark Tuckman with Tuckman Geospatial. And what he did was he assigned to, let me back up. So ridge lines were identified in the Bay Area, and so they're just polygons that show where all the ridges are in the North Bay Area. And he took those polygons and assigned the average fire hazard for those polygons, as well as the average fire hazard a mile surrounding it, and whether there were structures within that mile buffer of that ridge, and he gave it a rating. And I said, oh, well, that would be perfect if we did that for all the communities. And so we went down that path, and that didn't really work. And so, but I still liked the idea enough that I thought we could do that for the entire county by just doing it this way. So this is a query-based risk assessment versus a raster-based risk assessment, or that's what I'm calling it. You guys can call it whatever else. So next slide, please. Oh, next slide, please. So basically what we're just going to do, we're just do spatial queries and zonal statistics to assign specific values to areas, all areas within Sonoma County. So we divided up the county into bite-sized chunks using just a simple tessellation function. It's, a thing that you do in GIS. It's really easy. They could be squares, they could be circles. In this case, I use polygons because it handles boundaries better. And so then these bite-sized chunks, or these polygons, we could associate data with them, right? And it could be whatever, right? We went ahead and added the hazard rating that we created for the multi-hazard mitigation plan. We also added the pyrologics hazard rating. So I don't know if any of you are familiar, but Pyrologic just came out with an updated up to 2019 updated set of data products that include hazard, ember production, risk to structures, all sorts of stuff for the entire state of California. And so and again, Sonoma Water is going to be coming up with the same thing. And so we could add all of those values to it because it's just a polygon, right? So next slide, please. So I'm just going to go through a quick example. So this map shows an area just east of Kenwood. I'm identifying the street Kennybrook Drive, and it goes up east up into the foothills just below Bald Mountain. It's a one-way in and one-way out street that serves a smattering of residents. Next slide, please. So again, we created that grid, and this grid, I think it's at, I want to say it's either 100 or 500 acres. I can't remember. And that size could be, we could adjust it. We can do 50 acres. We could do 2,000 acres. This felt like a reasonable chunk, but by all means, make suggestions. Next slide, please. So we added data to it. So one was structure density, really simple GIS exercise. And not only did we do structure density, but we also did just the number of structures. And so we can characterize the entire county, by the number of structures within that area. Next slide, please. And same thing, we added the Sonoma Hazard Index. So each polygon now has a number of structures and the hazard rating that was assigned to that area. Next slide, please. And we also did the same thing for the Pyrologic Hazard Index, so that we can see that, oh, wow, I'm calling it R because I worked on it. The Sonoma Hazard Index showed that particular polygon as being rated 5, and Pyrologic's data set rates it as a 3. So that's a conflict, right? So next slide, please. So we can use that data. Well, with using the polygons, we can, because they're just attributes that are associated with each of the polygons, we compare, we can say now, oh yeah, okay, their hazard said it was high, theirs said it was moderate, and we can also combine them and give it an average, either an average or in this case, we added it up. We added, I think it was either 5 or 6 different quantiles. So there was the hazard index that we created, the Pyrologic hazard index, what the average hazard was, I think either 1 mile buffer around each polygon, and then for both hazard ratings. Then we did the structure density, and maybe I can't remember if there was some other, I think that was it. And then we added that up and gave each polygon a rating. And we could do this for any other risk assessments or any other source of data that we might want to include. So things like, next slide, please. I can't remember what I have on it. Yeah. So the other things that we can include are just, CAL FIRE's fire hazard severity zones, because so many people use that. And if folks want to be able to attribute it with that data, they can. Road density is a big one, right? Because evacuation was something that folks identified. So we could flag places that have high hazard, high structure density, and low road density. We can also include the known assets like power lines, communication towers. That is definitely something that we were going to do anyway, but doubly so now. Radio towers, and other infrastructure. And so all of these attributes can be given a value, and then we can either combine the value or we could average it. We could talk about that later. And that can determine each area's level of risk. So next slide, please. So our questions to you is, how do you envision using this proposed CWPP risk assessment, what I just proposed? Will this method, do you think it'll adequately incorporate other wildfire risk assessment efforts? What else would be useful to you to include in this query-based risk assessment? And how might we adapt or adjust the CWP risk assessment to be most useful in your work around fire in Sonoma County?
Thank you, Esther. So first of all, are there any questions about the risk assessment, about this query model versus doing a new risk assessment? It's a great way to be able to continue to aggregate data and all the new risk assessments and analyses that are going to be happening in Sonoma County, and kind of look at how they're all working together.
It seems to me there's such a thing as too many data sets to pile on. So I think you should say, give a rationale for how many data sets you're trying to combine together, and give a rationale for whether or how they're being weighted. I think if CAL FIRE, like a data set shouldn't be used just because a lot of people are using it. You should use the best available data sets.
Correct.
So not too many of them. And I also wasn't sure what the word conflict meant on one of those slides.
Well, they conflict, right? Because ours says it's a 5, which is our highest rating. And then Pyrologics is saying that area, and the reason people see this stuff, right? they go out there and they want to know what the rating is for their home. And they're going to see that ours says that they're 5 and that Pyrologic says that they're only a 3. They're only a moderate. And so why is that? Well, lots of reasons, right? So the Sonoma, so just context, the Sonoma Hazard Index was developed using the fuel model layer that we created from a vegetation to fuel model crosswalk. And that vegetation layer was, I want to say it was developed based on LiDAR in 2014. It was a while ago, right? Everybody complained that it was outdated data and why are we using it? I'm like, well, we're not going to go out and remap the vegetation. It's just not going to happen. Too much money. So we're looking for other data sources and other things. And it's just so happened that Pyrologic just released this 2019 updated data or data products that were based on 2019 data. So that's why we used Pyrologic's data. That's why we included it.
And Jason, did that answer your question about the difference between Sonoma Hazard and Pyrologic's hazard?
I may not have answered anyone's question. Sorry.
I also heard yesterday that the whole Pyrologic's project had been canned. So who knows what's going to happen there, and that's happening at the statewide scale. So
correct.
I think it's just important to be clear that it's a very subjective thing to, first of all, take these bend rankings. So, the difference between a 3 and a 5 may not be that different if you unpack, what the scale is.
It's true.
And I mean, to Caitlin's point, I think the more directly interpretable the products are, and I mean, when I get concerned, if you have 2 different hazard indices, you don't know which things are being double counted or not counted. Or I guess I would say I'd really want to be clear on that. And what's the strength and weakness? I'm not sure people are going to take the time to compare and contrast all the data sets. I think they're looking to, for us to kind of resolve that for them. And so I think it's okay. And I mean, I just was repeating through my head, like, risk is really a combination of the hazard, and that's what the Sonoma Hazard Index is, as an example. Like, that's the hazard if everything lights on fire, how intense is the hazard in any particular space in the landscape. And then the exposure is what you're bringing in with the homes, right? I mean, that's what's exposed. And then what people are really concerned about is what's the vulnerability that results from those things combining. So for me, somehow it's clearer to break out, like, here's our hazard map. And now in this process, we're intersecting the things we really need to protect to define to prioritize those zones where some kind of treatment or project is required. So I don't know, I guess I'm for sort of simplifying it. And yeah, I just kind of agree there's too many data sets, it can get confusing. So, and that's the part I feel less comfortable with personally, is the asset valuing. I mean, because obviously valuation is part of what you put in there. So I guess that's part of my feedback would be, I think we should break the hazard away from the exposure, and then really define, especially use the public input to define what they value in terms of assets at risk to help define the priorities, which are a lot of things actually based on what you guys said. I mean, for example, I don't know if there's watershed values incorporated into this at this point, or water supply.
No,
I just want to take one quick second to point out that.
Hold on, we've got a couple people, Jason, we've got a couple people in the queue. So go ahead, Esther,
Sure.
and it's gonna be John Mack and then Jason.
I lost my thought. Go ahead. We'll move on.
Go ahead, John.
So these wildfire indices, and Esther's right, there's several of them. In fact, we just did a new one for the multi-jurisdiction hazard plan, like we updated and added to the story map there. And they're good up to a point. The thing is that they tend to all show areas that are developed and outside of the wildlands as low. So Larkfield and Coffee Park and all come out low because they're built out areas. And for the 95% of the smaller fires, that's correct. But we know that for the 5% of the fires that are the big wind-driven ember events, that all bets are off, that those communities can be highly at risk from the ember event especially. And then that goes house to house ignition, you know, at that point. And so to me, I would suggest maybe thinking, you know, what's our goal here? Well, and I've heard Supervisor Rabbit say this several times, you know, and other board members agree, they want a generational change for Sonoma County and how we live with and deal with fire. What does that mean? Well, I'm going to suggest a couple things. One, it means that, and this is not going to, and as Caroline said, this is not easy to do, but the goal over 10 or 20 years is we harden most structures that we need to. So residences, infrastructure like the isolated towers, like the Mount Jackson's water infrastructure, that we have good defensible space at most houses in most years. Okay, that we have achieved that most places in the county. Those two would be, and then the third would be vegetation management. And I think we need vegetation management, sort of the landscape scale, that it needs to be focused on the places where it counts. And the places where it counts is in and around large agglomerations of people and structures. Well, I'm going to suggest that the county breaks into 3 bins really pretty easily. We've got isolated houses and rural landscapes, as you know, and that's a relatively small percentage of our housing stock in the aggregate, probably. And the only thing that those, in a sense, if those houses in those situations, the best way for those structures to survive is good defensible space and structure hardening. And if that landowner wants to do vegetation management beyond that, you know, more power to them. And then we need good, safe ingress and egress to get fire vehicles in and to get people out during the big fires. Then we've got small rural neighborhoods. These are smaller agglomerations of houses. We all know where they are, you know, they're all scattered around, like, you know, Reevely Road area or Bug Creek, and there's up on Sonoma Mountain. I mean, there's these sort of smaller, denser agglomerations. And then the third thing is we have about 2 dozen, maybe 3 dozen, depending on how you want to cut it, communities. So we've got the main 101 corridor communities, the Sonoma Valley communities like Glen Ellen that was just shown. We got the West County, Rio Neto, Guerneville, Guernwoods, Occidental, Camp Meekers, Summer Home, you know, Park. And to me, that should be, I think, to me, that's how we should sort of break the landscape, because the approach in each of those areas will be slightly different.
So do you have a specific comment in terms of how you think we should adapt the risk assessment for that?
Well, I think this is one of the ways that you partition risk, is you say how we're using the landscape and living on the landscape drives the risk, and then the projects that you would undertake in those landscapes. Around the dense community types, we want to harden and defensible space most of the structures, even ones that are in suburban settings. And we want to do landscape level vegetation management outside of them to slow the fire down and calm it and keep it away. And
right, so here you're talking about the projects, but the question is about the risk assessment and the assessment we're doing and the data we're using and the analysis. Is there something you think we need to adapt to get to what you're saying?
Well, I don't think you need to do a high GIS analysis to do what I'm saying. Correct. Other than looking at structure density. Mm-hmm. We know where the communities are, and we know where the dense structures are. Okay. And that you can map those and then say, I want to focus on the places where most of the people are, and then that's where you do your 3-part thing: defensible space, structure hardening, and veg management.
Okay, thank you. And Jason, I'm gonna get to you in just a moment. So the question right now is, does this risk assessment, will it work for you? Are there, is there other data, or is there a different way of looking at it that you'd all like us to see us use in the CWP? And alongside that, is there something that we might add to the risk assessment or change in the risk assessment to make this exercise more useful in your work. And one thing we heard from Lisa was that definitely showing that exposure side and the community values. And I want to remind you all that we do have the community engagement process open through August 31st through the online hub site. So that is a good place for you all to direct people in your networks to go there and either take the survey or draw on the map to tell us where those community issues are, because the workshops were just one set of generating that public input. And there's a couple comments come in, but go ahead, Jason, and then Robert.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention one that I thought that the scale was appropriate. Two, that a note that I had for myself, but you brought it up in the presentation, was about road density and its ability to actually move people. And so I think that's a really important thing to talk about, is the size of houses versus the size of roads and our ability to actually move people effectively. I would like to see that as a map. And then the last thing I wanted to say was just that this is a countywide CWPP, but we anticipate that we're going to be having more focused CWPPs that are going to be, so say, we've already got the Sea Ranch is an example, right? Like, there are other communities that are going to be able to zoom in a little more fine, and so I think that that's okay to have this at a higher level general discussion, and we just know that we need to have communities working together. The other thing that I'll just point out is that a lot of this work that we're waving our arms around talking about is going to happen on private land. And so until you have buy-in from those private landowners, nothing will happen. So the community discussions, the low level community engagement is going to be the only way you're going to get your projects complete. And that's all I got.
Thank you, Jason. Robert, and then we have a question from Monica in the chat.
Yeah, thank you. My question is about, I guess, would it be possible, or is there, I don't know, based on the workshops, is there any intention of incorporating some of the values identified by the public? I don't know, the one that kind of popped to mind was the watershed values that then got like teased out into several different more like natural element landscape level values, including that into the risk assessment somehow. I'd be interested to see how that might shift the weight of some of those hexagons. For example, I was saying, like, if the idea of protecting old growth forests came into play, like, would that shift the risk assessment for some of the areas in the county where those areas are prevalent, like along the river communities or up in the Mill Creek area?
Thank you. And while Esther's thinking about answering that, I will say that part of what we asked people in identifying those values, such as old growth forest and or the community center, is where are those priority areas to protect when there is a fire? So recognizing that. Go ahead, Esther. Is there anything else?
Oh, did I have to answer something? What am I answering?
If I could throw in really quick.
Go ahead, Carly.
I think that one of the things that we need to think about is how, any project should come with a menu of benefits, right? So if we have a project that protects a high value ecosystem and has the potential of providing an anchor point to stop fire spread, they're all points that should be hit in any prioritization. So I don't think we should look at one or the other. I think that we should look at them together and also tease out environmental versus landscape type treatments.
Thank you. Go ahead.
And what I was just going to say, everything that everyone's been bringing up, one of the benefits of doing it the way, doing it as a polygon versus a raster-based analysis, is that we can add and subtract things easily. So, and that's my main question, is that if we're okay going with a polygon-based risk assessment versus a raster-based risk assessment. And so, and if we don't understand that, we don't have to go there. We'll just ignore it. But everything that you guys are saying we can easily represent in a polygon-based risk assessment. And yeah, there is going to be a lot of data associated. The attribute list is going to get pretty long, but I also think it'll be fairly understandable, and we could whittle it down to categories, but we'll have to think about it. But this is all good. But I definitely need to think about it before making any more changes.
Yeah, I think my concern with a polygon-based or a polygon-based assessment might be that it's the, like what you're saying, Esther, like the data just becomes so stacked so high. And so then how do you tease out like the truly important elements, where a raster-based data set, I feel like, really flattens that plane, and it's just like this defined like point on the map, that pixel on your computer screen, like that is the risk of that area or something like that.
Yeah, I understand that. I mean, I've done tons of them. I just finished one for Napa County that everyone is raving about, but they're not using. So they're not hard to do, but they're time consuming. It's a little difficult to change. Once it's done, it's like set in stone. Not necessarily set in stone, but it's done, right? And whereas I just saw that this would be an easy way to incorporate all the other stuff that's going on. But if we don't want to go there, we could go back to doing the raster-based risk assessment. It'll be I saw several questions. I didn't answer them, but I saw several questions in the chat that talked about weighting. And we would have to go there for a raster-based risk assessment. So weighting each of the values will become an issue, and we would use the votes that folks gave us.
So I'm going to need to move the discussion on so we get done on time. And I see, Bradley, you have a question, so maybe you can hold on that. There were a few questions, and I think they got resolved in the chat. So I encourage y'all to look at that. If you have specific questions related to or suggestions related to the risk assessment, reach out to Esther directly, especially if you've got ideas about how we're doing it, this hexagonal approach. And Amanda, could you put Esther, put your email in the chat.
Yes.
We're going to move on to talk about the CWPP document. And again, this is just a brief intro. We're not going to try to edit by committee today. Really just want to show you kind of what we're thinking to get you stimulated. And that's the great thing today, is I think we've stimulated a lot of ideas in terms of what we heard from the community and also the risk assessment. And so then, we'll want to get you all thinking and then be talking to all of us as we move this through this summer. So with that, Esther, let's move on, and Amanda, to the next slide, and let's talk about the CWPP document itself.
All right. The CWPP document. So we have the 2016, or is it 2017? I can't remember. CWPP outline. It'd be helpful for you to have in this if I were working. So those are the questions that we want you to. Hopefully, you had a chance to review the old one and the new one, and have some suggestions. Next slide, please. So we'll just go through this really quick. So this is just a screenshot of the TRC. You can actually look at the finished CWP on the Fire Safe Sonoma's website. It was pretty, basic and thorough. It went through a profile of the community, the wildfire environment in general, just what's wildfire's ecological role, that sort of stuff. And next slide, please. It also went through the wildfire history, wildfire potential, and then included some maps, and it divided out the community. Oh, and also did the risk assessment. And then I think it's the next slide is where at the time they had divided out the county as, she also included mitigation strategies and just a bunch of other stuff. But the main point was that they divided out the county by the CAL FIRE units. And so the discussion on projects were kind of tailored towards that. Only there was, you know, also just a countywide project list. Next slide, please. So we don't have plans to divide out the county in any specific chunks, other than maybe by supervisor district. We might include some stats by supervisor district, but for the most part, the county will be treated as a whole. And basic, we're not, I mean, I don't think any of the sections that we're suggesting are any different than, you know, any other CWPP, but if you've gotten a chance to look through it, maybe there's something that we missed that you might want us to add in there, or maybe we've put too much attention on something. Next slide, please. And then that's the last one. And then the next slide, please. So our questions to you: what additional sections do you think we need? Do you think that there are sections that we could port over to online content and not have such a big document? Maybe. And then are there any sections that you think we should be removed or abandoned from the old, that you noticed that we're old? Because the plan was to, you know, port a lot of the old into the new.
So any general comments, and I'd love to hear from folks who haven't spoken up much yet in the meeting. And again, we've got some time to be thinking about how this is going to work, and you can be talking more specifically with Esther and Caroleon if you have some specific ideas. Caitlin says the entire plan online. I'm definitely looking at, and if you haven't checked out the hub site, do, because a lot of the information and data can be there. There's one issue about an online plan, and that with the Healthy Forest Restoration Act and the need for the signatories, is that they need to sign something that's static. But then there can be parts of it that are continuing to evolve. And Jason brought up earlier about, you know, the work happening at the community level, and Roberta mentioned there are the 8 local CWPPs, and those will continue to evolve and happen through Fire Safe Sonoma and continue to be linked into this process. So any other general comments about the CWPP outline and structure and how we might have it online or not? And again, back to that question of how can all this work that we're doing support the work you're all doing in Sonoma County for fire? We want to make sure this is a living, working document and process that supports your work. And it's not just a static thing that sits on a shelf.
Well, I could say that to support our work, there is so much confusion out there about sort of the causes and effects of different problems that people have with wildfire. And if the CWPP can be a bit of a ray of clarity, that would be massively helpful. And I brought up earlier, like this section, I think it's 3, that's titled "The Scope of the Wildfire Problem." Like, we have to define what the CWPP means by the wildfire problem, because it could be 45 different things. So which piece of wildfire is the CWPP taking on, and which pieces is it not taking on? So define the problem, and then talk about the causes of that problem. Where does that problem come from? What is it caused by? And related, I think in the list of factors that's there now, again, there should be a section that says one of the things that burns people's houses down is other people's flammable houses. So flammable houses and fences and other structures, I think people really need to understand that the buildings are part of the problem. Not only is it where we need to focus the most attention, but like this is a big part of why we have this problem, is because we have a flammable housing stock.
Correct. And that's one of the mandates of a CWPP, is to address structure ignitability. So,
right, but it doesn't show up in the, I think it needs to be sort of a title somewhere.
Okay.
It needs to sort of have its place.
Just highlight it and make sure it's
well, and I think that will reflect the Sonoma County approach really well too, because in terms of the state and the national perspective, Sonoma really is a leading example of an area where people are tackling the structural hardening issue more than anyone else. I mean, the FEMA grant that you all have is really one of the first in the nation. I think Sonoma and Ashland, Oregon, and maybe one other place nationwide are even starting to do that. So Yeah, I agree. And remember that's a community wildfire protection plan. So we can really focus on what does that mean as a community side and those community WUI values, all that you were mentioning, Caitlin. It's a good point to really emphasize that.
And I could say, that this is a plan, and this plan is going to move into policy. So it is going to roll into, as I've stated in the chat, the safety element of the general plan. So it will become, part of the way we do things.
Another thing I didn't see in the outline is ignition sources.
Okay.
Where do they come from? What are the trends? What, are there obvious things we should be doing about that? Which I think there are.
I think as far as the data, I haven't looked closely at the data, but I mean 99.9% is humans.
Yeah, but but much more detail than that. Barbecues, lawnmowers.
Correct.
Just to get
the thing that was sort of addressed in the other plan, as I recall, but those tend to vary by battalion, and so the old plan was broken up into the CAL FIRE battalions, and the prevalent ignition sources tended to be different from battalion to battalion. For example, in the West County, PG&E was #1. In other parts of the county, they weren't #1. So it's not necessarily something that you can dice up really finely. But the for sure thing is that there are 3 primary causes of fire, and they are men, women, and children. And and then there's the other obvious stuff, which are typically vehicle into the wildland ignitions. Clearly, we have an issue with power delivery. So, and many of those ignition sources sort of, most fires are accidental, and there's not a lot we can do about that. So the amount of emphasis that needs to go on ignition prevention, I think it's not as important as other stuff in many ways.
Jeff, could you speak to that? You had a comment in the chat.
Oh, yeah. So as a fire prevention specialist, ignition source data is how we tailor our program. You can't do a good prevention program if you don't know what's causing your fires.
Okay.
And you can do something about fires. And it's been proven through our data that if you target ignition sources, then you can reduce the number of fires. You can't eliminate all fires, but to not address those in a plan, I think, is disingenuous, because you can do all the hardening in the world, but if you're still having fires, you're still having problems.
Yep. Okay.
And that there are programs that a CWPP can address versus the enforcement and engineering part that the fire departments perform. Public education is right up a CWPP's alley, but you rarely see it included as a action item.
Thank you. I want to go back to the slide about the subcommittee. Amanda, could you pull that out? So we skipped over this when we moved on to the risk assessment. But one thing we were hoping out of today is to get a group of folks out of the steering committee who would be interested to volunteer to work with us to further analyze and finalize the list of master projects, and looking at that between the public input that we got, those that are identified in the local CWPPs and other priorities, especially what we're hearing today, and start working through the spreadsheet that Caroline created, and then augment it with the risk assessment. So I don't know, Esther or Carolyn, if you want to say anything more about that, but otherwise, is there anybody, a handful of people to help work on that would be great. And I could volunteer a couple of folks who've been speaking up, perhaps, but let's see who's interested.
So what we're wanting to do is to come up with a really good data-based means of prioritizing the projects that are submitted into the plan, so that we are judging projects by the number of high points they hit in a variety of contexts. And that's what that matrix did. And what I want to do is I want to get a bunch of other expert opinions and thoughts on how our prioritization matrix, which Roberta and I together created based on some work that had been done up in Lassen and other places. So that's what we're really after, is how do we prioritize projects and give them a score that is not, that's justifiable, so that we're not making stuff up, we have points. And that's what we want to work out, and we're looking for as many people who are willing to work on that project as we can get.
So looking for volunteers right now, not comments. John, are you volunteering? Yay. Thank you. We've got one.
I'll see if one of us can talk ourselves into volunteering. I don't want to commit right this second.
Great, thank you. Anyone else that might be willing to volunteer?
Tani, I'll volunteer representing Ag.
Awesome, thank you, Tani.
Great, thank you, Tani.
And perhaps someone from law enforcement and or fire service, or both. Don't be shy, I know everybody's got a lot on their plates and we're going into a big fire season.
I can reach out and volunteer some fire, dude.
Okay. I want to get through the last couple of slides, and then whoever can hang out and for a more open discussion would be welcome to. But Amanda, can you take us to that ongoing engagement slide at the end? Basically, just a reminder again that I mentioned earlier that the public engagement process and input process is open until August 31st, and that you can do that, anybody can do that through the hub site, which includes that public input map where you can actually go on and add a polygon and add all the information you want, or through the survey, you can do the same thing through an online survey. And then also people can provide input via email to the project email, or you can just email Caroline directly. So there's the hub site in the chat, and if you could put the email link in the chat, Amanda, and send me to the next slide. Sorry, I know you only have two hands. So there we go. We've got, that's the website that the county has, and then the hub site with all the various sets of data. It's a great resource. And think about that too, in terms of what else might be missing there that would be really useful to you, because the idea is to have it all in one place. And then that project email is the official email we're using for receiving input. But as steering committee members, you are welcome to email any of us directly. And with that, we have 3 minutes left. So I'll open it back up. I don't know, Esther, Carolina, was there anything you wanted to add before that? And Roberta asked about instructions for how to add things on the site. There is a link on the hub site that shows you how to do it, how to add information to the map and to the survey. And Richard, please go ahead and unmute.
Hi, everyone. Richard Diaz, Sonoma County Department of Emergency Management. Probably saving this last comment here towards the end. Just want to mention, since 2016, last version probably did not mention anything about evacuation exercises, which is something that we're really putting a lot of focus on. It'd be great to at least make mention of that. I see here in section 5, an action plan where you refer to wildfire preparedness and evacuation readiness. Maybe just to somehow capture that. I think it's something that we're moving towards implementing more often in the communities, and with that, the communities also hopefully help us develop their own evacuation plans or local plans as listed here. And they are, I believe, attempting to capture that at the local level CWPPs. So just kind of on a wider scope, just see if we can link that into this plan for this revised version. And also maybe a link to the evacuation map, the one that has just recently been released, if that makes any sense with the preparedness part.
We have it on the hub site.
Okay, great.
Yeah, but and if there's specific language that you want us to use, I mean, by all means, that's already been prepared and ready to go, by all means, forward that to me and we'll just stick it in there or include it as an appendix or
Well, thank you. Sorry, I have not checked the hub site recently, but yeah, I'll make sure to let you know of any inputs if needed. And that was all. Thank you.
Thank you.
And so I think, Caroline, why don't we officially close the meeting, but we're going to stick around for half an hour for anybody who wants to hang out and talk more, because this has been a great discussion and we could obviously have this meeting last all day. So Caroline, why don't you give us the official closing?
Thank you again to everybody for attending and for having such awesome thoughts. And please keep those coming. If you don't talk to us, we don't know what you're thinking. So I'm officially closing the meeting at 4:30.